Hi guys, this is Hussain Raza. Today we're gonna discuss the concept of consumer surplus. So let's define consumer surplus before. Consumer surplus occurs when the marginal utility acquired from the consumption of a good is greater than the price which the consumer is paying for it. In other words, consumer surplus occurs when the value derived by the consumer from the consumption of a good is greater than the price which the consumer is paying for it, or we can say the price which is the market price. In further words, we can define consumer surplus as it occurs when the consumer is willing to pay a higher price than the market price or than the price which he actually pays for it. So for example, you went to a restaurant, you ate something there. For example, you ate biryani there. Biryani was very delicious. There were a good amount of meat pieces. There were a good amount of spices and many other things which you usually like. And you thought that when the bill will come, that would be around 200 rupees. But when the bill came, the waiter came and he presented the bill to you, it was only rupees 100. So it means that you were placing a value of 200 rupees on that biryani on the basis of the value driven by you. But the market price of that biryani or the price on that shop was 100 rupees. So it means that you are deriving extra value from the consumption of that. You are deriving extra value, you are deriving extra utility from the consumption of that good. And that feeling is actually the consumer surplus. Right? Consumer surplus can be further understood with the help of the following diagram. Please see the following diagram. In the diagram, you can see demand curve and supply curve. Demand and supply curves are intersecting at rupees 5. So it means the market price is rupees 5. We already know that the demand curve of a consumer shows that at what prices, what quantities the consumer is willing and able to buy the good. For example, you can see there that for the first unit, consumer is ready to pay 9 rupees. Because it's the consumer, from the consumer's point of view, in the consumer's perception, the market price, the price should be 9 rupees. The value driven by him is 9 rupees. But the market price of that good is 5 rupees. So consumer is deriving a consumer surplus of 4 rupees there. For the second unit, consumer is not ready to pay rupees 5. Consumer is only ready to pay rupees 8 because his marginal utility has fallen. So when the consumer is willing to pay 8 rupees now and the market price is 5 rupees, now the consumer is only rupees 3. Then at 7 rupees, the consumer surplus is 2, 6 rupees, it is 1 because 6 minus 5. And at the fifth unit, consumer is willing to pay 5 rupees, market price is also 5, which shows that the value derived by the consumer or the utility acquired by the consumer of that good is equal to rupees 5, and the price is also rupees 5. That's why at the fifth unit there is no consumer surplus. But we can see that by consuming 5 units, consumer has derived a consumer surplus of 10 rupees. A consumer surplus of 4 rupees on the first unit, 3 rupees on the second unit, 2 rupees on the third unit, 1 rupee on the fourth unit, and 0 on the fifth unit. The consumer cannot go beyond the fifth unit at the market price of 5 because if the consumer will do so, it would derive a negative consumer surplus. How? Let's see. You can see from the diagram that for the sixth unit, consumer would be only willing to pay 4 rupees. But the market price is still 5. So it is evident that if the market price would be above, then the value which the consumer is deriving from the good, there would be negative consumer surplus. So mind it, whenever demand and supply curves are intersecting each other, whenever there is equilibrium quantity, there the consumer surplus has been maximized. Consumer cannot buy further units at rupees 5. So I think you have got the point that how to calculate the size, the consumer surplus, and what the consumer surplus is. So the area below demand curve and above market price is consumer surplus, right? Now we would see that how the price elasticity of demand for a good would influence the size of the consumer surplus. To make you understand, consider the following 4 diagrams. In the first diagram, you can see that demand curve is perfectly inelastic, right? When the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, it means that consumer is ready to pay any price for the good. And when the consumer is ready to pay any price for the good, it means that the value derived by the consumer would always be above price because he's ready to pay any price for the good. So in that case, consumer surplus would be infinite. In the second diagram, you can see that demand curve is getting flatter, a bit elastic. So you can see that the size of the consumer surplus has shrunk, right? And in the third diagram, in the diagram C, demand curve has become more flat, which is showing that size of the consumer surplus has further shrunk. In the diagram D, you can see that there is no consumer surplus. Demand curve is perfectly elastic there, and supply curve is intersecting it at quantity Q. This shows that there is no consumer surplus because the market price is equal to the price which the consumer is willing to pay. We can also say that at this price, the price is equal to marginal utility. Therefore, there is no consumer surplus derived by the consumer there. So mind it that when the demand curve is perfectly elastic, consumer surplus is 0, and when the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, the consumer surplus is infinite. Right? I hope this is clear. Now onwards, we'll see that how indirect taxes and subsidies influences the size of the consumer surplus. We know that whenever an indirect tax is imposed, supply curve shifts vertically upward. And whenever a subsidy is given, the supply curve shifts vertically downward. See the following diagrams. You can see there that the market price for the good is price P. And the size of the consumer surplus there is DAP. Later on, a tax is imposed, an indirect tax is imposed, due to which supply curve shifts vertically upward. And when supply curve shifts vertically upward, the price goes to P1. And therefore, the size of consumer surplus, the leftover consumer surplus, is now DAP1. And the loss of consumer surplus is PABP1. So, it is clear that whenever an indirect tax would be imposed, the price for the good will increase in most of the cases, and there the size of the consumer will be reduced. In the second diagram, you can see when a subsidy is given, the supply curve is shifting vertically downwards, and when the supply curve is shifting vertically downwards, the price is changing. Initially, the price was P. At price P, the consumer surplus was DAP, but when the price fell to P1, and now the consumer surplus is DAP1. So you can see that whenever subsidy is given, the price would fall and the size of the consumer surplus would increase. So the gain in consumer surplus there is PABP1, right? So this is clear that whenever indirect tax would be imposed, the size of the consumer surplus will go down, and whenever subsidy would be given, price would fall, and that's why the size of the consumer surplus would increase. I hope that the concept of consumer surplus is clear to you now, and how the price elasticities of demand are influencing the size of the consumer surplus. How will we calculate the size of the consumer surplus, and how changes in indirect tax and subsidies will influence the size of the consumer surplus. I hope you will like this video and will share, please. Thank you very much.